So I really like Star Wars Return of the Jedi. It's a fun movie. But unlike Empire Strikes Back or A New Hope, there are a few things that if I had a time machine and I could go back and change whatever I want, there are a few things in Return of the Jedi that I would change. That's in contrast to A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back, which, except for some tiny little nitpicks that I have, I think those are absolutely excellent and I wouldn't change anything. But unlike A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back, there are a few substantial things that I dislike about Return of the Jedi. Now, I don't want to imply that I dislike everything, like the prequels, which, I'll end up talking about those eventually, but the prequels, they have many, many things that I dislike about them, and even the couple of good things that are sprinkled in there, all of the bad things pretty much overwhelm good things to make them, well, corrupted, bad in the end. However, in my opinion, which, that's what all of this is just my opinion, but in my opinion, that's not the case with Return of the Jedi. But that's enough wishy-washy abstract talk for now. Let's get down to specifics. Specifically, my first point. So I want to start this section by saying I do actually like Jabba's palace. So from the very beginning when the droids show up, all the way to the end where they fly off in the Millennium Falcon, I like everything that's there. With the exception of the very, very stupid musical number that they added in the special edition. That's obviously horrible. But all of the original content, I like it. However, I think it all ends up being a little bit longer than it needs to be. Think about the structure for a second. You have setup number 1, which is all of the different characters coming into Jabba's palace. Then you have payoff number 1, which is Luke confronting Jabba and then fighting the Rancor. Which, again, I like all of that. But then you have setup number 2, which is all of the characters are around Jabba's ship and Luke's about to be thrown into the Sarlacc pit. And then you have payoff number 2, which is the fight around Jabba's ship and Jabba getting killed and all of that. Obviously, we do the same thing 2 times, and it ends up feeling kind of wasteful. Remember, all of this first third on Tatooine is really just a side adventure to set up the characters again. It's not actually the bulk of the movie. So if this is a side adventure, why is it that we have 2 setups and 2 payoffs? And as I said at the beginning, I do actually like everything that happens. I like the first setup, I like the second setup, I like the first payoff, and I like the second payoff. But since all of this is just setup for the rest of the movie, I really think they should have cut out the first payoff and the second setup. So once everyone gets into the palace, there's a confrontation, and Jabba maybe runs to his skiff. Well, he's a giant slug, so not run, but somehow escape to his ship, and then the final payoff that we see in the movie could happen more or less like it does. Maybe minus the Sarlacc pit, which you don't really need for the plot. Again, I like everything, but it just ends up being slightly too long for an introduction to the rest of the movie. Now, I'm going to reference Jabba's palace a few more times, but that was the main point I wanted to get across here. So, moving on to the next point. Okay, so this section is going to be me talking about a bunch of the different characters. And I decided to start with Lando because he does the least out of all the characters. So broadly, Lando does 3 different things in this movie. So number 1, he sneaks into Jabba's palace and then saves Han from getting killed. Number 2, there's the very brief scene where he's like, "Hey, they made me a general." And then number 3, he's in space flying around the Millennium Falcon, isolated from every other character. Well, technically not isolated from every other character. But Nine Nub barely counts, so I don't think we even have to talk about him. You can probably tell from the way I described what happened in the movie that I really think the problem with Lando is that he was not with the other characters on Endor. I mean, Billy D. Williams is just so great, and it's annoying to have him separated from Han and Leia. And this is all ignoring the fact that Lando Calrissian and Luke Skywalker have about 2 sentences each where they talk to each other. There's one tiny exchange they have at the very end of Empire, and then they each say one sentence to each other after they've destroyed Jabba's ship. I mean, it's annoying because one of the greatest things about Star Wars is the relationship between characters. Think about A New Hope for a second. Han thought Obi-Wan was a crazy old man. Obi-Wan thought Han was a show-offy pilot, which, he was. Luke looked up to Obi-Wan as a mentor/surrogate father figure. Obi-Wan's views on Luke were complicated, and were further complicated with stuff we learned about later, but they were still interesting. Just like in real life, you have a small group of interesting people who each think of and behave differently to different members of the group. And with all of that said, I can just imagine, perfectly in my mind, I can just picture what Luke would think of Lando and what Lando would think of Luke. There's so many potential and interesting, funny interactions there, but we never got to see them because Lando, in Return of the Jedi, was separated from all the other characters. And again, I like Lando, and everything that he does in the movie is good. I just wish there was more of him. So I'm putting Han and Leia in the same point because my thoughts on them are pretty connected. Let me start off by saying I really like their romance subplot in Empire Strikes Back. It's funny how they like each other, but won't admit they like each other, and then they have to go on an adventure pretty much with just the two of them. And then there's a tragic ending where they're ripped apart. It's all very good and all very Star Wars, so I like all of that. And I even like their first scene together in Return of the Jedi, where Leia wakes up Han. What I don't like is the lack of interaction between them after that point. This ties into a couple points, but I really think there should have been a scene where you have all four of the main characters interact on the Millennium Falcon after they leave Tatooine for the first time. Lando and Luke could have interacted. "Hey, I told you my plan would go perfectly, didn't I?" Yeah, but why did we have to sneak in separately? And then Lando and Han could have interacted, acknowledge that Lando betrayed Han, but then make a joke about it because they were constantly betraying each other in the past. And then Han and Leia could have talked to each other briefly, where they don't completely acknowledge that they're more in a relationship now, but it's just slightly different from the way they were before. It would have been nice. What we actually got was, we have a good introduction scene where Leia wakes up Han, then minimal interaction for a third of the movie. Then there's a really peculiar misunderstanding where Leia knows that Luke is her brother, but she doesn't tell Han, and she's confused, and Han's confused, I'm confused, everyone's confused. And then it's all pretty much resolved at the end when Leia's like, "Oh, Luke's my brother." And that's it. That's all that Han and Leia have in that movie. Not that there needed to be any sort of complicated fight or, them getting married or something, but what there was just confusing, so I would have actually preferred if they had taken out that misunderstanding section and just instead added some nice interactions. But outside of the confusingness, which is Han and Leia's relationship, I actually like all of the stuff that Han has to do in this movie. It's good. He's funny, his interactions with Jabba are good, and it's all good. What I like less is Leia in this movie. What I dislike, I think, is best illustrated by looking back at the previous two movies. She's so distinct in episode 4 and 5. Then going into episode 6, she's just sort of there. Her conversation with Luke, where she finds out that Luke's father is Darth Vader and that she's Luke's sister, I think that's the low point for that character. The way she reacts doesn't seem to match how we've seen her in the past. On top of that, they don't really utilize her skills at all. For instance, why wasn't she the one who motivated the Ewoks to help them fight? Why did we do that theatrical thing with, C-3PO's a god, and then C-3PO explains the story of Star Wars? Theoretically, Leia is the best communicator out of all of them. She was a princess, and she was already a high-ranking rebel when the other two were just nobodies. But they don't use the fact that she would be able to rally people to their advantage. Instead, they use a different character to do the same thing. My point isn't that they had to do exactly that. My point is Leia doesn't really get to do anything in the movie. Unlike Lando, she does have good interaction with everyone else, except for the weird misunderstanding thing with Han. But she doesn't really get to use any of her skills, which I think would make it more interesting. So I put these three together because, well, I don't really have any complaints. My favorite part of the movie is everything with Darth Vader, Luke, and Palpatine. Luke maybe potentially falling to the dark side because of uncertainty and anger. That really works for me. I like Vader and his redemption and everything with that, and I like the Emperor. So every bit of this section with those three, I like. I only really have two complaints. Well, they're not even complaints. They're just minor things that I want to talk about, which maybe could have been different, but in general, everything with the section I like. So the first thing is the lightsaber fight, which generally is really good. The only thing is, I think it maybe could have had a bit more variety. I mean, they're fighting in an environment which is very similar to the Cloud City environment from Empire, and it's just Luke and Vader. There's no new person involved in this, in the actual fighting. Obviously, the Emperor is in the room and talking. And all of that talking, the talking between Vader, the Emperor, and Luke, that's the highlight of the movie. That's the best part. But I think the fighting itself, they could have maybe done something to spice it up. Maybe those Imperial guards could have helped. Just anything to substance-wise distinguish it from the Empire fight. But again, I love the talking, and even though it's kind of a repeat of the Empire fight, I do like the fight itself, so that's good. My second point was not about the fight itself, the, hitting lightsabers against each other, but the talking that goes on during that. Because obviously, every good lightsaber fight, the New Hope one, the Empire one, and the new ones in the sequel movies, every good lightsaber fight, the discussions between the characters are the main event. And that main event in Return of the Jedi is really good. The only slight thing that I dislike is kind of philosophical, in that they leave out the philosophy of the Sith. Because conceptually, the idea with the Sith is, alright, we want to achieve world peace, or galactic peace, and we're going to do anything to achieve that peace. I mean, they're still evil, and they know that they're evil. They murder underlings left and right, and they call themselves the dark side. But in the end, it's all for the greater good. They have to control everything. They have to impose order. At least, I think that's the idea behind the Sith. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But they don't really talk about that. It's just sort of assumed, or maybe not assumed. I don't know. That's not what the conversation in Return of the Jedi is about. It's all about Luke and giving into temptation and striking out in anger, which is really good, again. But I think that, combined with the do whatever is necessariness of the Sith, would maybe be slightly stronger. I don't hate them. They're fine. No, I'll actually talk about them. The reason I make that joke is, generally, the Ewoks are the most disliked thing about Return of the Jedi when people look back on it. And now, many years in the future, it does seem like they're kind of indicative of things to come. But we want to look at them in the abstract. Just, if you're sitting down and watching the movie, is it a thing that you like or a thing you don't like? And in a similar vein, I'm aware that Lucas has said that the Ewoks were supposed to be a metaphor for the Vietnam War. But I don't really care about that. I feel like you can ignore the metaphor and still like or dislike the Ewoks. So, with that said, let's actually get to talking about them. Now, my overall opinion, like I briefly mentioned with the gag before, is that I don't actually mind them. I think they're fine. But there are two ways in which I could see them being better. The entire section where we meet them, before the fight with the Imperials, it's sort of played for laughs. And it's really unlike anything else that has happened in Star Wars before. Now, as I've mentioned before, obviously, good sequels do new stuff, but I feel like this new thing, comedic little teddy bears, is not actually a good new thing. Like, it doesn't match well with the other stuff in the past. The giant space worm in Empire Strikes Back wasn't a joke. It was, ooh, what is this dangerous thing in this hostile universe? So on that front, the Ewoks aren't ideal. Then the other thing about the Ewoks is the entire fight scene with the Imperials. And again, this is a metaphor. And in real life, smaller, less well-equipped forces have been able to defeat technologically superior, larger forces. But that doesn't change the fact that it looks stupid for tiny little stuffed animals to be able to kill stormtroopers by throwing rocks on their heads. Imagine if, in The Last Jedi, the Porgs had had a scene where they fought off some First Order stormtroopers. That would have been stupid there too, right? On top of that, all of Star Wars is about a smaller, less advanced force taking on a larger, more advanced force. It's the rebellion versus the Empire. This is like the core story of Star Wars. So it's a little silly to have the Ewoks represent that, but in an even more ridiculous way? I don't know. Just doesn't make sense to me. Now, I didn't come up with this, but I really like the suggestion that it should have been Wookiees instead of Ewoks. It would have visually looked better, and you could have even still had some, like, baby Wookiees at the camp for toy sales and stuff. On top of that, it would have given Chewbacca something to do. We could see him interact with peers, like people who are like him. We've never seen that in a Star Wars movie. He's always just been really grumpy or annoyed or, just following Han around. And speaking of Han, if they were Wookiees instead of Ewoks, you can do some really funny stuff, I think. You can establish that he and Chewbacca have run across Wookiee tribes before, and he never likes it, because Chewbacca always wants to stay for like a week, and he doesn't like Wookiee food or something. So when he realizes it's Wookiees when they're trapped in the net, he's like, oh no. Now, I don't think they had to do all of those specific things, but my point is that if the Ewoks were Wookiees, it would just fix a lot of the things that I don't like about the Ewoks. On top of that, Leia giving a rousing speech to convince the Wookiees to fight the Empire would make more sense if they were Wookiees, like, proud warriors instead of little teddy bears. That would work better there too. But again, despite my complaining, I don't actually hate the Ewoks, so I think they could be better, but I don't think they're awful. Ah, the Death Star. The superweapon so nice they built it twice. Or even thrice. Well, I don't think Starkiller Base really counts, but I'll talk about that in a minute. My general point with this is confusion, really. I'm confused why the Death Star 2 looks exactly like the Death Star 1. As far as its use in the plot, I'm fine with that. I don't think the plot of Return of the Jedi needed to be fundamentally different. I'm just talking about on a completely aesthetic level. Why isn't the Death Star 2 like a cube or something? Just anything to distinguish it from the first one. I mean, what I actually think they should have done is, instead of having a super weapon, another Death Star, it should have been the last large Star Destroyer building facility. It would just make more sense if they were investing in Star Destroyers instead of another single giant super weapon. I mean, people make fun of it, but the fact that it could be blown up so easily is, well, stupid. But if it was a production facility that was making Star Destroyers, that makes sense as a reaction to the failure of the Death Star. I don't know, it really just feels like laziness or trying to cash in on the previous movie's success. Now, with that said, in Star Wars The Force Awakens, there's obviously Starkiller Base, but I actually mind that less because visually it's different. That's my main point with Return of the Jedi. I just want something that's slightly different, just something slightly new. So, this is a point which I really think represents what I dislike about Return of the Jedi. My main complaint with the movie isn't what is there, it's what could have been there. The conversation Luke has with Yoda is fine, it's good even. I like him talking, I like what Yoda says, and I even like Luke's conversation with Ghost Obi-Wan afterwards. My point is this: why is it that Dagobah looks exactly the same as it did in Empire Strikes Back? It's a pretty great opportunity to do something visually to reinforce the impact of Yoda dying. My main thought is, Luke arrives and everything is dead. Because it's a swamp, it's filled with life. There's life everywhere. There's life on your boot, there's life in the sky. But when Luke shows up, the trees are dead, there's no green anywhere. It was always muted green, but there'd be no green. My point is that it's strange that you could put together the scene from Empire and the scene from Return of the Jedi, and except for Luke's outfit, you can't really tell how they're different when they're in the hut. One great thing about the leap from the end of A New Hope to Empire Strikes Back is that it really feels like things have happened. The rebellion is not in that same base on Yavin 4, all of the characters have changed slightly and grown over time. But with Yoda's hut and the swamp around it, it's like it's stuck in time, nothing changed. And as I've been saying throughout this whole video, they don't have to do exactly that, but I think there's lots and lots of potential for just something more than they did. It's all missed opportunity. Lando was great, but I wanted to see him interact with the rest of the cast more. The Ewoks are fine, but I think Wookiees would have been better. The lightsaber fight on the Death Star was cool, but I think there were ways to spice it up more. The discussion on the Death Star was really good, but I think there were a few little changes they could have made to make it even better. And the point I started with, Jabba's palace was excellent, but it was just slightly too long. I like pretty much everything in Return of the Jedi, but I can see how most things could be slightly better. And in the end, that's what I think about the movie.